I didn't cry when I realized my engagement was over. That surprised me. I was sitting at a long wooden table, the kind people save for holidays and big announcements. Candles burned low, wine glasses clinked softly. Someone laughed at the far end, too loud, like they were trying to prove everything was fine. My fork hovered in the air, halfway to my mouth, and that's when I heard it. A sentence whispered just quietly enough for them to think it was safe. Not meant for me, not meant to be understood, but I understood every word. I'd been taught to listen long before I was taught to speak. My grandmother raised me that way. Pay attention, baby. People tell you who they are when they think you can't hear them. The woman across from me leaned toward her son, my fiancé, and murmured something in a language she assumed was private. She said I was temporary. She said I was convenient. She said once the wedding was done, I'd disappear on my own. And my fiancé, he smiled, not a nervous smile, not confusion, agreement. That smile cracked something open in my chest, so clean and sharp I swear I heard it, but I didn't move, didn't gasp, didn't expose myself. Instead, I took a slow breath and let them keep talking, because when people think you're invisible, they confess everything. My name is Aaliyah Brooks. I'm 31 years old. And until that night, I truly believed I was building a life with a man who loved me. We'd been together just under 3 years, engaged for 6 months. The wedding was weeks away. From the outside, it looked perfect. He had the job everyone bragged about, the polished smile, the family dinners, the traditions. People told me how lucky I was. What they didn't see was how small I'd been trained to become, how often I swallowed words to keep peace. How many times I told myself this is just how close families are. I grew up different. Quiet house, no big gatherings, no loud opinions drowning you out before you finished a sentence. So when I stepped into his world, his loud, layered, tightly controlled world, I mistook dominance for love. I wanted belonging, I wanted roots, I wanted to be chosen, and for a while I thought I was. That dinner was supposed to be another celebration, one more step toward forever. The food was rich, heavy, slow-cooked everything, the kind of meal that demands patience. Everyone spoke easily around me, switching languages mid-sentence, laughing, touching shoulders. I stayed polite, stayed calm, stayed quiet, because I had learned that interrupting meant disrespect. And respect, apparently, was my responsibility alone. That's when the whisper came, that's when the truth slipped out. And that's when I realized something terrifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan. A plan I had unknowingly been walking into, smiling the whole way. I didn't confront them, not yet. I let the moment sit, let it burn. Let it settle into my bones, because some endings don't explode. Some endings arrive quietly right before you decide whether to save yourself. I met Daniel Whitmore on a random Thursday I almost canceled. It was one of those long work days where your feet ache before noon and your patience runs out before the coffee does. A coworker dragged me to a small neighborhood fundraiser, cheap wine, folding chairs, forced smiles. I remember thinking I'd stay 10 minutes. Daniel was standing near the back, jacket off, sleeves rolled, laughing like he didn't care who heard him, not loud, just easy, like breathing. When we started talking, the room faded. He asked questions and actually waited for answers, didn't interrupt, didn't perform, didn't try to impress me with money or status. He asked about my work. I told him I was a school counselor at a public middle school. I waited for the usual pause, the polite nod, the subtle downgrade. Instead, he said, "That's important work." Just like that, something in me relaxed. Looking back, I think that was the moment I handed him my trust without realizing it. Daniel came from money, but you wouldn't know it at first. He dressed simply, drove a modest car, paid attention. On our third date, he told me about his family. "They're intense," he said, smiling like it was a joke. "But they mean well." That should have been my first pause. People who warn you early are usually telling the truth softened. But I didn't pause, because when you've spent most of your life being independent, being chosen feels like rest. The first time I met his mother, Evelyn, she hugged me too tightly, held on just a second longer than comfortable. Her perfume was sharp, her smile precise, her eyes assessed me the way people inspect fruit at a market. Not curiosity, evaluation. She complimented my hair, my posture, my voice, then asked where I came from, not what city, what kind of family. I answered honestly. Single mother, only child, grew up learning to stand on my own. She nodded slowly, filed it away. I didn't know then that this information would later be used against me. Daniel's family had rules, unspoken ones, dinner every Sunday, holidays together, no exceptions, decisions discussed collectively. At first, it felt warm, structured, like belonging had a schedule, but slowly I noticed something strange. Daniel never made big choices alone. He'd say, "Let me check with my mom," about things that didn't involve her at all. Restaurants, travel dates, even how late we stayed out, and when I questioned it, he'd brush it off. "That's just how she is. She means well. She worries." I told myself love required patience. I told myself families were complicated. I told myself I was lucky. The engagement happened fast, too fast. He proposed at a lake house surrounded by his relatives, everyone clapping, cheering, recording. I remember saying yes before I fully processed the question, because everyone was watching, because saying no felt like ruining something already decided. Evelyn cried. She hugged me again. Whispered, "Welcome to the family." I didn't realize then that what she meant was ownership. In the weeks that followed, plans began forming around me, not with me, around, dates set, venues suggested, traditions enforced. Every time I tried to slow things down, Daniel would squeeze my hand and say, "Just get through this part. This is important to them, always them," and I didn't notice how rarely he said us anymore. The night of that dinner, the one where my fork froze in midair, wasn't the first crack, it was just the loudest, because before betrayal speaks clearly, it whispers, and I had been hearing whispers for months. I just didn't want to listen. The first time I felt embarrassed in front of his family, I told myself it was accidental. That's what people do when they don't want to see the truth yet. They soften it, round the edges, make excuses so they don't have to walk away too soon. It happened at one of those Sunday dinners. Long table, assigned seats. Evelyn at the head like a judge who never needed to speak loudly to be obeyed. Someone asked about my job. I answered the same way I always did, steady, proud, honest. I talked about the kids I worked with, the ones dealing with things most adults couldn't survive, the reason I stayed late most nights. Evelyn smiled, that smile again. Then she turned to Daniel and said something softly in another language. The table laughed, not hard, not cruel on the surface, just enough. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I asked lightly, "What did she say?" Daniel hesitated. Then said, "She just thinks it's sweet you're so devoted." The pause before devoted told me everything. I laughed too, because that's what you do when you don't want to seem difficult. Later that night, I asked him again. "What did she really say?" He sighed like I was exhausting him. "She said you're very kind, but not exactly ambitious." That word landed heavy, not ambitious, as if caring for children was a phase, as if my purpose was temporary. I swallowed it. After that, it happened more often. Side conversations, glances, sentences I wasn't meant to hear. They spoke freely around me, assuming I couldn't understand, and I never corrected them. Because correcting them would mean admitting I'd been listening all along, and I wasn't ready to be exposed yet. The wedding planning became the next battleground, guest lists rewritten, venues changed, my suggestions acknowledged then ignored. When I pushed back, Evelyn would tilt her head and say, "This is how our family does things." And Daniel would add, "It's not worth fighting over." But it was, because every compromise asked of me came with permanence. Every compromise asked of them came with flexibility. The dress was where I almost broke. She took me to a boutique I couldn't afford, picked something heavy, elaborate, sparkling. It looked beautiful on someone else. She announced she'd pay for it before I could object. Everyone applauded. I smiled while my reflection stared back at me like a stranger. I didn't feel like a bride. I felt like a mannequin. That night alone, I cried quietly. Not because of the dress, but because I realized something painful. I was being reshaped, and I was letting it happen. I stopped speaking up, started translating myself smaller. I watched my words before they left my mouth. I chose silence because silence felt safer than resistance, because resistance brought tension, and tension made Daniel distant, so I adapted, because love shouldn't feel like walking on glass, but I convinced myself it was normal. The whispers continued, about my career, about when I'd settle down, about how long I'd keep working once I had children we hadn't even discussed, and every time Daniel would reassure me privately. "She doesn't mean it that way." But meaning doesn't matter when impact is consistent. The night of that dinner, the one that shattered everything, I already felt tired, not physically, spiritually, tired of proving I belonged, tired of shrinking. Tired of being polite in rooms where my future was being decided without me. I didn't know then that I was about to hear the sentence that would free me, but some part of me was ready. Because survival silence can only last so long before it turns into clarity. Money changes the temperature in a room. You can feel it before anyone names it. For Daniel and me, money entered quietly through a shared account we opened for the future: wedding expenses. Rent planning, adult things that make you feel like a team, at least that's what I thought. I contributed what I could, not equally but honestly. I was upfront about my salary, my limits, my boundaries. Daniel made more. Significantly more. He said it didn't matter, but his family noticed. And they cared. The first time money became a weapon, I didn't even know it had been used until after the damage was done. I logged into the account one evening to pay a deposit. The balance was lower than it should have been, not by accident, by thousands. I stared at the screen, convinced I'd misread it. Checked again, then again, my chest tightened. When I asked Daniel, he hesitated too long, then said, "My mom needed help." Just like that, no discussion, no warning, no permission. He'd moved money we both contributed, money meant for our wedding, to help her handle something she didn't want people knowing about. I felt invisible. And disposable. I told him that crossed a line. He told me I was overreacting. She's family. That word again, as if I wasn't about to be, as if my trust was optional. After that, I paid attention. The comments sharpened. Evelyn began asking questions about my finances, what I saved, what I owed, what I planned to bring into the marriage. She framed it as concern, but concern doesn't audit you, control does. Then came the conversation about my job. I'd been offered a promotion, more responsibility, more money, more fulfillment. I was proud. Daniel smiled, but his eyes didn't light up. He said, "We should talk about it with my mom." I laughed, thought he was joking. He wasn't. That Sunday, I shared the news. Silence fell, then a flurry of words, not in English, fast, sharp, decisive. Daniel's shoulders slumped as they spoke. Finally, he turned to me. "She thinks it's bad timing." Bad timing for whom? For starting a family? I felt something snap. We hadn't planned children, we hadn't agreed on timelines, but somehow decisions had already been made, just not with me. I said no, clearly, firmly. The room chilled. Evelyn smiled like I'd just failed a test. Daniel didn't defend me, he didn't challenge her, he just watched. And that's when I understood something I'd been avoiding: love without loyalty is just performance. The final weeks before that dinner felt heavy. I slept poorly, worked longer, delayed joy. I felt like I was waiting for something bad to happen, like standing on tracks while hearing a train in the distance, still hoping it would stop. Still pretending it wouldn't hit me. That dinner wasn't the beginning, it was the confirmation. The moment the truth stopped whispering and finally spoke clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it. And once you hear the truth clearly, you can't unhear it. That dinner started like every other one: too much food, too much wine, too much pretending. Evelyn had outdone herself: roasts, handmade sides, candles placed just so it looked like love, it smelled like tradition. I wore a dress she'd once approved of. I was tired enough not to care. People talked around me, not to me, around. Languages shifted mid-sentence. Laughter rose and fell in places I didn't belong. I nodded when appropriate. Smiled when expected, played the role I'd been rehearsing for months. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a whisper. Evelyn leaned toward Daniel, her voice low, confident. She said I was temporary. She said once we were married, I'd either change or disappear. She said it like a strategy already tested before. And Daniel smiled. That was the moment, not the words, the smile. Time slowed. I noticed the scrape of silverware. The clink of glass, someone chewing too loudly. I felt strangely calm, like my body had known this was coming before my mind did. They kept talking, planning, laughing, discussing my future as if I were furniture they might replace. And I sat there, fully aware, fully awake, fully done. I didn't interrupt. I didn't expose myself yet. I let them keep going, because when people think you're powerless, they reveal how cruel they are. At one point, someone asked Daniel something directly. He answered without looking at me. That's when I knew this wasn't something he'd fix later. This wasn't confusion. This was alignment. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't shake. I thanked Evelyn for dinner. I said I wasn't feeling well. I stood. Placed my napkin neatly on the table, and in the same language they'd used to erase me, I spoke clearly and calmly. Every head turned, every face froze. Shock rippled through the room. Evelyn's color drained. Daniel whispered my name, too late. I said I'd understood everything, that I always had, that I wasn't temporary, that I was leaving, and that this wedding was over. Silence followed me out the door. Not one person stopped me, not one person chased me. Because control only works when you stay. I didn't cry until I was in the car, hands shaking, heart pounding, but under the fear was something else. Relief. That sentence didn't break me, it freed me. The drive away from that house felt unreal. Streetlights blurred. My hands shook so badly I had to pull over once just to breathe. I kept replaying the moment in my head, my voice, their faces, the way silence followed me out like a shadow. I didn't go home, I went to Renee's place. Renee had been my best friend since college, the kind who tells you the truth even when you don't want it. She opened the door, took one look at me, and didn't ask a single question. She just hugged me. That's when I cried, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears soaked into her shoulder while months of tension finally drained out of my body. When I finished telling her everything, she didn't hesitate. "You're not going back," she said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. Daniel started calling before I'd even fallen asleep. Missed calls, voicemails, texts stacked on top of each other. At first, I didn't read them. I needed silence. But the next morning, curiosity got the better of me. The messages followed a pattern: confusion, denial, minimizing, blame. He said his mother didn't mean it that way. He said I misunderstood the tone. He said I embarrassed him. Not once did he say, "I'm sorry they hurt you." That absence told me everything. By the second day, the family joined in, texts from cousins I barely knew. Messages framed as concern but dripping with accusation. "You should have handled it privately. You overreacted. Family matters stay in the family." Funny how family only mattered when it benefited them. Then Evelyn showed up, unannounced. At my job, I saw her through the glass before she saw me, standing stiffly at the front desk, posture perfect, lips tight. For the first time, I didn't freeze. I stepped outside to meet her. She didn't apologize, she lectured. About loyalty, about respect. About how much Daniel was suffering. I listened calmly, then said, "You planned my erasure," out loud in front of me. She called it a misunderstanding. I called it truth. When she realized she couldn't control me anymore, her tone changed. Tears appeared. Victimhood followed. I ended the conversation with one sentence: "Please don't contact me again." I walked back inside, stronger. That night, I did something important. I documented everything. Screenshots, dates, times, bank statements, not for revenge, for clarity, because people who rewrite history rely on your doubt. I wasn't going to doubt myself anymore. Daniel sent one final message that night: "I never thought you'd actually leave." And there it was, the truth hiding in plain sight. He'd never believed I would choose myself. I blocked his number, not out of anger, out of self-respect. Leaving didn't end the chaos, it exposed it. And once exposed, there was no putting it back. I used to think leaving was the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching what happened after. Because once I stepped out of that family dynamic, there was no one left to absorb the tension. No one left to smooth things over. No one left to translate discomfort into silence. Without me there, the cracks showed fast. Daniel tried to regain control the only way he knew how. He showed up again, this time with flowers and a speech clearly rehearsed. Renee didn't let him inside. She stood between us like a wall and said, "She asked you not to come." He looked stunned. As if boundaries were a foreign language, he waited outside anyway, so I stepped out. Not because I owed him closure, but because I wanted to hear him when he no longer had an audience. He said he'd spoken to his mother. Said things would change, said he'd set boundaries now. That word now echoed. I asked him one question. "Why now?" He didn't answer. He talked instead about stress, about pressure, about how hard it was being caught between two strong women. Two? As if his mother and I were equals in that situation, as if I hadn't been the one bending. I told him something he wasn't prepared to hear. "You weren't caught between us. You chose her, every time." His face collapsed, not in anger. In realization, because denial can survive almost anything but not clarity. Over the next week, I heard things through mutual acquaintances, arguments at Sunday dinners, raised voices, doors slammed. Evelyn turning her sharp focus inward now that I was gone, Daniel's father retreating further into silence. The sisters suddenly on edge. I realized something uncomfortable. I had been the buffer, the soft place where tension landed. And now that buffer was gone, Daniel emailed me a long message. No excuses this time, just fear. He admitted he'd assumed marriage would settle everything, that I'd adjust, that his mother would calm down once I was locked in. That word again. Locked? I read the email twice, then closed it, because love shouldn't require endurance training. Meanwhile, something else happened, something quieter. I slept better, I laughed without checking myself, I spoke freely. The constant tightness in my chest faded, peace crept in slowly like it wasn't sure it was welcome. One afternoon, I sat alone and realized I wasn't angry anymore, I was clear. And clarity is dangerous to people who rely on confusion. Daniel tried one last time, a voicemail, his voice breaking. I don't know who I am without my family telling me who to be. That was the most honest thing he'd ever said. And the saddest, because it also meant he wasn't ready to choose differently. I didn't respond. Some lessons can't be taught, they have to be lived. As days passed, the family story began shifting. I was too sensitive, not strong enough, never really one of them. I let them talk. People who know the truth don't need to defend it. What I didn't expect was the call that came next, from someone I never thought would reach out. Daniel's father, his voice was quiet, heavy. He said, "I should have protected you." That sentence hit deeper than any apology before it, because it came from someone who finally saw the cost of silence. Leaving didn't just end my engagement, it disrupted an entire system. And systems don't like disruption, but they need it. When Mr. Whitmore asked to meet, I hesitated. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I didn't trust Hope anymore. Hope had kept me quiet too long. Still, something in his voice felt different, not defensive, not strategic, just tired. We met at a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral ground, public, safe. He arrived early, hands folded, shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for decades. "I owe you an apology," he said before I even sat down. "Not we, not my family, that mattered." He told me he'd seen the pattern long before I arrived, how Evelyn controlled through criticism wrapped in concern. How peace in that house only existed when everyone complied. "I taught my children silence," he said. "I thought it kept things stable." His voice cracked. "I see now it just taught them fear." He asked me what had really been said at that dinner. Not to challenge it, to understand it. I told him everything, word for word. He didn't interrupt, didn't excuse, didn't minimize. He just closed his eyes when I finished. And whispered, "She said the same things about me." That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't about me, I was just the latest target. He told me he'd confronted Evelyn after I left, really confronted her. She denied it at first. Then blamed me, then blamed him, then cried, then went cold. He said, "I realized I've been shrinking my whole life to keep the peace, and watching her try to destroy you woke me up." I didn't know what to say. I hadn't come to dismantle a marriage, I'd just come to save myself. Before we left, he said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is walk away. And sometimes that gives others permission to do the same." I hugged him, not because he was family, but because he finally acted like a human being. What I didn't know then was how far the ripples would spread. Within weeks, things unraveled. Evelyn's control tightened and people pulled away. Daniel's sisters started pushing back. One quietly, one loudly. Arguments became unavoidable. The system couldn't survive without someone absorbing the damage. And for years, that person had been whoever loved them most. Daniel sent one last message. "I think my parents are separating." I stared at the screen for a long time. I felt sadness, but not guilt. Because accountability feels like chaos to people who have never faced it. At the same time, my life kept opening. I finalized the cancellation paperwork, returned gifts, closed accounts. I donated the wedding dress. That part felt symbolic, letting go of something beautiful that never belonged to me. People asked how I was holding up. I told them the truth. "I'm okay, I'm learning how light life feels when you're not constantly bracing for impact." The strangest part, I didn't miss Daniel. I missed the version of myself I thought I'd become with him, and that version deserved better. One night, weeks later, I sat alone in my apartment and realized something profound. I wasn't grieving a breakup, I was grieving an illusion, and illusions hurt more to lose than reality. There's a moment after chaos when everything goes quiet, not peaceful quiet, honest quiet. That's where the truth finally has room to sit with you. It happened on an ordinary morning. I was folding laundry. Sunlight coming through the window, no phone buzzing, no tension humming under my skin, and it hit me. If I had married Daniel, I wouldn't have lost myself all at once. I would have lost myself slowly, decision by decision, silence by silence, until one day I wouldn't recognize the woman in the mirror and I wouldn't know exactly when she disappeared. That realization shook me more than the breakup ever did. I replayed moments I'd brushed aside before. How Evelyn praised obedience more than kindness. How Daniel admired strength only when it didn't challenge his comfort. How love was always conditional on my willingness to adapt. I'd confused endurance for commitment. That's a mistake a lot of women are taught to make. A week later, I ran into someone who sealed the truth for me. One of Daniel's cousins. She pulled me aside quietly and said, "I wanted to warn you, but I didn't know how." She told me about the woman before me, different name, same story, engaged, slowly pushed out. Labeled difficult when she resisted, gone within a year. I felt cold, not because I was shocked, because it all made sense. That's when the weight lifted. Because if the ending was predictable, then my leaving wasn't failure, it was escape. Daniel tried once more, not to get back together, just to talk. He said therapy had opened his eyes, that he finally saw how much control shaped his life. I believed him, and still I said no, because awareness doesn't equal readiness. And love isn't a rehabilitation project. That night I wrote a list, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd gained: my voice, my time, my peace, my future. The list was longer than I expected. The wedding date came and went. I spent it with friends, we cooked, we laughed, we didn't toast to anything, and somehow that felt perfect. I didn't feel victorious, I felt grounded, which is better. Later I heard the family narrative had shifted again. Now it was, she was never right for him. I smiled when I heard that, because they were finally telling the truth, just not in the way they thought. That night, lying in bed, I whispered thank you, not to fate, not to timing, to myself. For listening, for leaving, for not staying long enough to disappear. The final fallout didn't arrive with shouting, it arrived with envelopes. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found a plain white letter addressed in careful handwriting. No return address, no drama. Inside was a short note: "I'm leaving, I should have left years ago. Watching what was done to you made it impossible to stay blind. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." No signature, but I knew who it was from. The news spread quietly after that. Daniel's parents were separating, no public announcement, no explanations offered, just a fact that settled into the community like dust after a collapse. People whispered, speculated, took sides. I stayed out of it because this part wasn't about me, and yet it was. Daniel called once more after that, not to plead, not to argue, just to say I didn't know how deep it went until everything fell apart. I listened. Truly listened, then I said something that surprised us both. "I'm glad you're seeing it now." He sounded relieved, then sad, then quiet. We said goodbye without promises. That felt right. What shocked me most wasn't the separation. It was how calm I felt hearing about it. No triumph, no satisfaction, just understanding. Because when control loses its grip, it doesn't go quietly. And when people finally stop absorbing harm, systems built on silence collapse. A few days later, Daniel's sister reached out, not to defend, not to blame, to apologize. She admitted she'd laughed at things she knew were wrong, admitted fear had kept her quiet, admitted my leaving gave her courage to speak. That message stayed with me longer than any apology before it, because accountability passed forward matters more than revenge. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth spreading. Like people waking up, like cycles breaking. The final piece came unexpectedly. I found an old notebook while packing away wedding remnants. Notes I'd written during planning, questions I'd silenced, concerns I'd minimized. The truth had been there the whole time, I just hadn't trusted myself yet. That night, I burned the notebook. Safely, carefully, watched the pages curl and darken, not in anger, in release. Because the woman who wrote those doubts didn't need to carry them anymore. The wedding date passed quietly, no ache, no regret, just gratitude. I slept deeply that night, dreamless, unburdened. And when I woke up, I realized something important. The justice I needed wasn't loud, it was peace. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, almost forgettable moments. Like realizing I could make plans without checking my phone first, like laughing without bracing for disapproval. Like choosing what I wanted for dinner without explaining why. Freedom showed up quietly, and at first I didn't trust it. I started therapy a few weeks after everything ended, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand why I stayed as long as I did. That part mattered. My therapist asked me a question in our second session that stopped me cold. Who taught you that love requires endurance? I didn't answer right away because the truth was layered. I'd watched strong women survive instead of thrive. I'd been praised for patience more than boundaries. I'd learned that leaving was weakness, not wisdom. Unlearning that took time. I grieved not Daniel but the future I'd imagined. The home, the stability, the picture I'd been holding onto. Grief doesn't care if something was unhealthy. It still hurts to let go of what you hoped would be different, so I let myself mourn without shame. Then something unexpected happened. I stopped blaming myself. I forgave the woman who stayed quiet at that table. Not because she was wrong, but because she was surviving with the tools she had. I thanked her, and then I let her go. Daniel faded from my thoughts slowly, not with anger, with distance. I heard through others that he was trying to change. I hoped he did, just not with me. Some chapters are meant to teach, not continue. My life filled in around the empty space. New routines, old friends, long walks with music instead of worry. I felt whole again. Not because someone chose me, but because I chose myself. One evening, months later, I sat alone and thought about that dinner, the whisper, the smile, the moment everything broke, and I realized something profound. That moment didn't end my life, it saved it. A year passed without ceremony, no countdown, no anniversary dread, just days stacking gently on top of each other until I realized I was living again, not recovering, living. I moved apartments not because I had to, but because I wanted a place that felt like mine. Sunlight in the mornings, quiet at night, no memories attached to someone else's expectations. I decorated slowly, nothing extravagant. Just pieces that felt like me. Work changed too. I stopped pouring from an empty cup, started saying no when I meant no, started trusting my instincts again. The kids I worked with noticed first. "You're different," one of them said. "Like lighter?" I smiled, because they were right. I heard updates occasionally. Daniel still lived close to his mother, still unsure, still learning who he was without approval as currency. I didn't feel bitterness, just distance. Distance is a form of mercy. One afternoon, I received a message from someone I didn't expect. Daniel's sister. She thanked me not for leaving him, but for leaving the situation. She said watching me walk away helped her set boundaries of her own. That mattered, more than apologies, more than closure speeches, because cycles only break when someone is brave enough to step out of them. I started dating again slowly. Not desperately, not searching, just open. I paid attention to how people made me feel, not how impressive they looked. I asked myself questions I'd never asked before. Do I feel safe here? Do I feel heard? Do I feel like myself? Those answers guided everything. One night, months later, I found myself at another dinner table. Smaller, casual, warm, people spoke to me, not around me, no whispers, no tests, no shrinking. And I realized something quietly wonderful. This was normal. This was what I deserved all along. I thought about the woman I'd been at that first table, fork frozen, heart pounding, trying not to disappear. And I wished I could reach back through time and tell her one thing: you don't need to earn your place. You already belong to yourself. That dinner didn't destroy me. It revealed me. And once revealed, I was impossible to erase. End of part 12. If you want to continue to part 13, consequences plus final emotional resolution, say, backhand index pointing right, continue part 13, we're almost at the ending. Continue part 13, what stayed with me? Some endings don't feel like endings at all. They feel like echoes, soft reminders that show up when you least expect them. Years later, I still catch myself pausing at dinner tables. Not in fear, in awareness. I listen more closely now, not just to words, but to tone, to energy, to what's not being said. Because silence taught me something important. It taught me how loud truth becomes when you finally hear it. I ran into Daniel once, by accident, a grocery store aisle, late afternoon, nothing dramatic. He looked older, not physically, emotionally. We exchanged polite words. He asked how I was. I answered honestly, "I'm happy." He nodded. Didn't ask follow-up questions. I think he already knew the answers would hurt. We wished each other well, and when we walked away, I felt nothing, no ache, no regret, just closure. That surprised me. Because for a long time, I thought closure required conversation, explanation, apology, but real closure comes when your body finally relaxes around a memory, when your chest doesn't tighten, when your breath stays steady. I never heard from Evelyn again, not directly, but I heard about her, how control isolates, how silence grows heavy when no one absorbs it for you. I didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity, because some people don't change. They just lose their audience. What stayed with me most wasn't the betrayal. It was the lesson that love without protection isn't love, it's access, that respect is never proven through endurance, that belonging should never require disappearance. I learned to trust discomfort, to pause when something feels off instead of pushing through it, to believe people the first time they show me who they are, and most importantly, I learned that leaving doesn't make you cruel, it makes you brave. There are nights I still think about that younger version of me, fork in hand, heart racing, trying to decide whether to speak or survive, and I feel nothing but compassion, because she did the best she could until she could do better. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you're shrinking, if you're staying quiet to keep peace, if you're being discussed instead of included, please hear this. You are not dramatic, you are not ungrateful, you are not imagining it. And you are allowed to leave. Some tables aren't meant for you, and walking away from them doesn't mean you lose, it means you finally choose yourself. I don't tell this story often, not because it still hurts, but because it doesn't. And that took time to understand. People expect endings to come with victory speeches, with revenge, with someone losing so someone else can win, but life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the ending is just silence and peace. I think about that dinner less now, not with anger, not with shame, just as a turning point. A moment where I finally listened to myself instead of everyone else, where I stopped trying to earn safety and chose it instead. I learned something important through all of this. Love should never require you to disappear. It shouldn't ask you to swallow yourself whole just to make room for someone else's comfort. It shouldn't confuse control with care. Or silence with loyalty. The right people don't test you, they include you, they don't whisper about your future, they ask you about it. They don't need you to be smaller, they make room for you as you are. I'm not grateful for the pain. But I am grateful for the clarity, because clarity saved me years of quiet misery I might have mistaken for stability. If I could say one thing to the woman I was back then, I'd say this: you're not too sensitive. You're just finally paying attention, and that will change everything. The table I sit at now is different. There's laughter without tension, conversation without fear, love without conditions, and when I speak, I'm heard. That dinner didn't destroy my life. It revealed the truth in time, and sometimes that's the greatest gift you'll ever receive. If this story stayed with you, if any moment felt familiar, if you've ever been made to feel small at a table you were invited to, please know this: you are not alone. Take a second to like this video so more people who need stories like this can find it. Subscribe to the channel for weekly, real-life inspired stories about boundaries, betrayal, healing, and quiet strength. And if you feel safe, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. Stories like this don't end when the video stops. If you believe stories can protect, awaken, and heal, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Every subscribe helps this channel keep telling the stories others are afraid to tell. Have you ever been spoken about instead of spoken to, pressured to shrink for love, or caught between peace and self-respect? I read every comment. Until next time, trust your instincts, protect your voice, and never let anyone else write your ending.